Actually, I had the talk written, but I listened to Susan, and there was this phrase on the screen that revolutions should be not dictatorships but experimentations. And I liked it so much, decided to trash the talk that I prepared and just improvise based on this small quote. It's called The Bet. When asked about the global legacy of 1917, one usually thinks of the elements of socialist and communist program, which were accepted and realized outside USSR. Thus, after the World War II, the welfare programs such as free education and healthcare were introduced in the Western countries as an implicit answer to the threat from the Soviet Union and from the local communist parties. The anti-imperialist movements and the respective readiness of the European empires to satisfy their demands happened with the support of and in view of the USSR as an active anti-colonial power. Gender liberation in the West was also pioneered by the USSR and grew out of the originally socialist women movements. We just heard a very nice paper on this in Boston, where many of us went for another revolution conference. The movement of 1968, which radically transformed the global society in the anti-authoritarian way, was inspired mostly by the leftist ideologies that went back to the 1917 revolution, even though the Chinese Revolution was also very important for that. So this is the general picture that we usually get when we ask great Western intellectuals, except Susan, about what the legacy of 1917 actually was. However, this mode of paying dues to the anti-authoritarian side of the Russian Revolution remains flawed, as long as it doesn't give justice to the event itself. Actually, welfare policies started being introduced in Europe under the pressure from the workers' movement since the second half of the 19th century. And in the 20th century, they were reinforced, not just because of the competition with the Soviet Union, but also within the logic of Fordism, as again we've just heard. The decolonial struggle relied not just on socialist anti-imperialism, but even more so on the belief in the national independence, which goes back to the European nationalism of the 1848 at least. As for the gender equality and anti-authoritarianism of 1968, the presence of a left-wing great power was certainly very important, but one must also admit that post-World War II Soviet Union was precisely not the best place to look at in search for these particular values. However, it is important to look at the destiny of these policies today after the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the state socialist project. All of them produced some irreversible progressive changes, indeed. But they were integrated into global capitalism in a way that reinforces class divisions. Anti-authoritarianism, welfare and gender equality for the rich countries, authoritarianism, neoliberalism, and often, for example in the Muslim world, patriarchalism for the states having recently gained their independence in the decolonial struggle. The very idea of revolution, which became legendary after the spectacular revolutions in America, France, and Russia, is today victorious in the sense that successful revolutions happen very often outside the West. But they mostly serve not to radically democratize societies, but to integrate them into the pre-existing global liberal capitalist order, so they are not very inventive. As for the political ideas, the disappearance of the authoritarian left of the Soviet Union has left us with a politically weak anti-authoritarian left, which is mostly concentrated in the American university. British also. What the 1917 revolution can indeed be remembered for, and what is still present and controversial in the life of these countries, are rather inventive and synthetic solutions to these open dilemmas of modern society. Lenin repeatedly accepts the widespread view that the socialist revolution is an experiment. For instance, mentioning the task of, I quote, converting the sum of culture, knowledge, and technology as accumulated by capitalism into the tools of socialism. If there are experiments in this area, he says, If we repeatedly correct partial mistakes, this is inevitable. This cannot produce a drop of pessimism, because the task that we set ourselves is the task of world historical difficulty and meaning. Or, a quote from 1919, Marx once said that it is to the credit of the Paris Communard that they carried into effect decisions which were not borrowed from some preconceived theories, but were dictated by actual necessity. Marx said this about the Communards in a somewhat ironical vein, because there were two predominant trends. There were two predominant trends in the Commune, the Blanquists and the Proudhonists, and both were compelled to act contrary to their doctrines. We, the Bolsheviks, however, acted in conformity with the tenets of Marxism. At the same time, the political activities of the Central Committee in each concrete case were determined entirely by what was absolutely indispensable. We were often obliged to feel our way. We didn't doubt that we should have to experiment, as Comrade Trotsky expressed it. We undertook a task which nobody in the world has ever attempted on so large a scale. In fact, end of quote. In fact, Bolsheviks, like the Blanquists and the Proudhonists, of course, had to realize policies contrary to their views. Take, for example, the NEP. To the extent that one can contradict the dialectical theory in general. It's not easy. The revolution put a bet on combining the contradictions, the contrary poles, the most important of them being the contradiction between the authoritarian technology and the radical democratic communism. They created a solution, a tentative solution, but of course they failed. Now, more on this synthetic solution. The general theory of this solution, of this political synthesis among the Bolsheviks was hegemony. And one of these great political notions that we actually owe to the revolution of 1917 and its preparatory period. Gramsci famously picks up this Lenin's notion in the 30s in order to reformulate the crucial role of Marxist intellectuals in a situation where they do not represent a social majority. The notion of hegemony was not Lenin's invention. It was widely used by the Social Democrats. He started using it in 1905 during the First Russian Revolution, speaking intermittently of the hegemony of proletariat and of the hegemony of Social Democratic Party. Before the 1917 revolution, Lenin used it to refer to the alliance between workers and peasants. What he implies in a larger sense is the question about the revolutionary subject and the need to make a revolution from the point of view of this subject, in a situation where the subject constitutes a minority of population and is even not yet constituted as such. After the 1917 revolution, Lenin and his comrades used this notion of hegemony in a different way. They used it to justify the NEP, the new economic policy, which was the partial liberalization of economy under the guidance of the party and of the proletariat that it embodied. So this is hegemony less of proletarians over peasants and more of proletarians over the bourgeoisie, small bourgeoisie, and over the hegemony of the party over the society. It is at that time that hegemony becomes a common word of official discourse in Soviet Russia and Comintern. And it is at that time that Gramsci actually learns it and borrows it. Even though the concept was used by Lenin and Stalin polemically against Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution, in fact, it is quite close to it. It is also about this idea of proletarian leadership in the circumstances that are essentially those of bourgeois revolution. So it is an attempt to square the circle in a sense. It was this latter, I already mentioned the Gramsci cut. In Gramsci, this is a word for both the ideological leadership, an analogue to the more traditional notion of authority, I think, and for the need for flexibility and for the substantive attention to the non-communist discourses. It is not by chance that Gramsci entitled one of his treatises "The Modern Prince." His affinity to his Italian compatriot Machiavelli is indeed striking. And it is the same Machiavellian connection that elucidates the eventful nature of the hegemony theory. The ideological parties of communist doctrine find themselves in a situation of crisis and historical rupture, where they must lead the society into an open future in the name of a yet non-existent class, in Gramsci, or of a not yet non-existent Italian nation, as in Machiavelli. A revolutionary event opens up a play of free recombination, and this recombination is only possible due to the overturning of hierarchy and to the emergence of a new, previously oppressed leading force. The hegemon is the one who imposes a synthesis on the otherwise disjunct elements. It is now that we can see the ambivalent and problematic character of the hegemony concept. First, it dialectically places the bourgeois content into a proletarian form, but provided the growing polarization between bourgeoisie and proletariat, this asymmetrical synthesis is actually very fragile. Secondly, hegemony dialectically combines the contradictory ideas of leadership and democracy. The event and the subjective virtuosity become then the only guarantee, the only foundation of holding the two principles together. It all hangs on a finger. Stalin actually also attempted a hegemonic policy by trying to integrate the ideas of both the left and the right wings of the party at the same time, like Groys famously argues. And by combining a large-scale conservative retreat with ultra-right radical revolutionary measures, such as forced collectivization and proletarization of the cities and the master against elites. This combination of opposites was short-lived and soon led to a dialectical reversal. Conservatism in this equation took over the revolutionary communism, and the two collapsed. And they collapsed in the 1980s, as we just heard, into a newly hegemonic conservative libertarianism, alias neoliberalism. In China, where this conservative maneuver was originally avoided, the hegemonic alliance of communism with liberalism still lives on. But even there, the substantive liberalism and subjective communism exist in an increasing tension. So the Bolshevik Revolution was not really successful in imposing a proletarian hegemony for any long time. By the end of the 30s, Stalin's ideology shifts from the emphasis on proletarians to the emphasis on the working people, and revives the imaginary of Russian nation. So Stalin essentially becomes a populist, and again Susan wrote about this. What remains, though, is the consistent promotion of popular spirit and the hegemony of plebeian culture and language, which Soviet Union managed to combine, again, hegemonically, with the support of highbrow intelligentsia in a very limited way and, under very strict control of the party, but intelligentsia was allowed to flourish along with the widespread plebeian emphasis. And actually, it is this plebeian hegemony that lives on. It is maybe one of the few things that we still preserve from the revolutionary time. Because if you look at the current Putin's Russia, it is a very plebeian culture. It is the anti-intellectual pressure, the cult of the simple man or woman in all TV channels, on behalf of which all the policies actually conducted. So, but this is a very weak remnant of revolution, of course, because the populist culture in politics is actually not a dialectical synthesis, but rather a dissolution of the contradiction in a false unity. Still, this dissolution happens from below and requires a constant effort of what I would call uneliting, to invent a word. It is therefore not by chance that today, in liberal democracies and beyond, in absence of any articulate class synthesis, it is populism that wins the day, not only in Russia. The Soviet experiment did try to avoid it and to produce something else, to produce a workable model of hegemony, but it only marked a symptomatic problem and fell into a symptomatic trap before the others did. So revolution, conceived by Marx as a dialectical synthesis of history, fell prey to its own dialectic. But the problems that it was trying to resolve re-emerged. Who would be the subject of potential global socialist revolutions? The multitudes, the educated minorities in alliance with the proletariat of global south, as some Italian thinkers suggest. But wait a minute, how do these groups actually understand each other? How, what about this plebeian insistence and plebeian synthesis in this highly intellectual, highbrow project? I don't understand this. Who would at least be the subject of global democracy? Okay, let's lower our stakes. Let's at least have the global democracy. But who would be its subject at the time when the global masses increasingly abandon democratic values? You can look at this country. Only a revolutionary event can provide an experimental and a synthetic answer to these questions. Now, as we know, Bolsheviks made a bet and then had to abandon this bet, not only on hegemony at large, but also on the very particular political institution, the political institution of Soviets. They did try to create a model where a participatory institution would coexist with a vertical state authority. The elements of democracy existed for a short time, because as you know, the contradiction was too deep. They could not coexist. There was basically a threat of civil war already in 1921 on the occasion of Kronstadt uprising. But this doesn't mean that the Soviets ceased to exist. They remained, as I would say, dormant institutions. And actually, there was still several attempts to democratize the society, this time through the party. Stalin, as we know from Oleg Kharportin's book, tried to make a democratic reform of the party in the 1930s, but it led again to even more disastrous results. The dormant institution of Soviets did, however, emerge one more time, this time under Gorbachev, who actually claimed to rely on Lenin's heritage and gave Soviets a new meaning. He basically empowered them and organized a full-scale revolution, of which he himself fell victim. So a disaster again, but a productive disaster. The revolutionary event happened again based on the Soviets. Hannah Arendt famously re-evaluated Soviets as a political experiment that extended beyond the Russian Revolution, and she characterized all genuine revolutions as spontaneous institution of political freedom. And yet, she herself recognized that these institutions of Soviets can only be ephemeral, that they have not been successfully reunited with actual machines of government and representation anywhere. So it's kind of a weak argument. Soviet Union at least extended the life of these institutions, of course only to attend to their suicides, but they existed for 70 years. So Soviet Union again marked the problem and symptomatically fixated on it. It preserved its name, but of course still didn't offer a long-standing solution. Now, next institution, national model. Like almost any other revolution in the past and in the present of modernity, the 1917 revolution was, among other things, a revolution of national liberation. We know that Lenin inventively and dialectically combined the issues of class struggle with national struggle. Claims that would seem opposite to most of his contemporaries, because during the World War I, of course, Socialist International had just collapsed precisely because of that issue. But Lenin insisted on nationalism as a positive value. And like in the case of Soviets, Lenin and Stalin, insisting on national liberation, did not really pursue a democratic or federalist agenda to the end. They built their national policy into their general authoritarian model, thus building what Terry Martin rightly called an affirmative action empire. Soviet Union was a state that supported ethno-national identities and cultures, fostered them, and organized privileged social mobility for the members of non-Russian nationalities. An ambiguous and imperialist policy, to be sure, but can we say that the cause of national democracy has been successfully dealt with since then? Has it been successfully dealt now? We have seen many new nation states emerging since then. But today the main issue is in most cases not their political sovereignty, which is okay if there is no war, but the inclusion and integration of ethnic minorities and generally of the populations of these impoverished independent countries back into democratic societies of the West. After the nations established their right to get out, they now struggle for their right to get back in many cases. The new radical slogans are no longer national independence, but rather global citizenship and global equality. But because there is no workable alternative, the political agenda of subaltern nations is rarely a progressive one. There are exceptions like the Kurd case. But more often, we witness a conservative revolutionary program, like in the case of various Middle Eastern fundamentalist movements. In this crisis of the liberal national model, the national policy of Bolsheviks appears, if not innocent, then at least not reactionary. It appears interesting. Therefore, a waste of revolutionary energy for the revolutions of national liberation today, and for the anti-neoliberal protests, purely speaking, and anti-neoliberal protests, I mean in the hegemonic Western countries, which ignore this global theme entirely and therefore rest localized. This waste of energy may be too costly. The real choices today is not between the socialism and barbarity, as back then, but I would say between revolution and fascism, as two main strategies of the oppressed. Let's skip section. Charles Fourier once observed that under communism, labor would become play. Marx objected, he didn't agree, but he actually reformulated more or less the same program as a plea for a society of disposable time. Marx doesn't develop his vision much, but I think he intuitively felt that a shift toward childish playfulness should not foreclose from us the seriousness of human existential endeavor, which labor, with all its faults, is still faithful to. So, for me, revolution is a glimpse into communism, a constituent experience on which any vision of such free future, not to be vain, must build. Therefore, a dialectical gamble of revolution may be only a serious play. We have to engage in this serious play in a society where a game like entertainment is ubiquitously used to undermine our historical states. Thank you.